Okay, I want to talk about colonial ideology. Now you might say, what the heck was that? Well, in the 19th century, Britain, France, the United States, Italy, to a lesser extent, Portugal, Germany, they all took colonies in Africa and Asia and all sorts of other parts of the world. And they did so by justifying it in terms of what we would call evolutionary racism or scientific racism. And I want to talk about this in a really specific way. In particular, how did that ideology get out to the rest of the world? The answer, or at least one answer, not the only answer, but one answer is Tarzan of the Apes. Now, you might have seen the Disney film, you might have seen the old show, shows, TV shows with Johnny Weissmuller. Tarzan's a big part of our culture. But I want to talk about the original book. The book was published by Edgar Rice Burroughs as Pulp Fiction in 1912. And it has sold millions of copies over the years. It's one of the best-selling books in history. So what is Tarzan, and what does that have to do with colonial ideology and, say, Britain and France conquering all of Africa? Let's look at it this way. The original plot of Tarzan is this. Two aristocrats, Lord and Lady Greystoke, are on their way for a humanitarian mission in the Belgian Congo. And on the way, they're on a ship, and the crew has a mutiny. They kill the captain and the first mate and the officers in the ship, but they like Lord and Lady Greystoke, and so they drop them on the coast of Africa in the middle of the jungle. And so Lord and Lady Greystoke are stuck in the jungle, and they build a cabin, and they have all sorts of stuff with them. They have all this luggage with them that the mutineers let them keep. But eventually, and they have a child in the jungle. But then when the child is still an infant, they are both killed or die in various ways. And the child is adopted by apes. And so he grows up thinking he's an ape. But then when he's about 12 years old, he finds the cabin that his parents had built, and it had a lock on the door, and the apes had never figured out how to open the door, but Tarzan figures out how to open the door. And he goes in there and he finds a gun, and he finds children's books, and he finds paper and pencil, and he finds a knife, and he finds all sorts of stuff. And he takes the knife, and he goes back to the ape tribe, and he uses it to kill the leader of the ape tribe and make himself the leader of the ape tribe. So now he's the king of the apes. But then he goes back to the cabin and he teaches himself how to read and write using the children's books. Now, a little while later, a bunch of Africans come into the part of the jungle Tarzan is in, and I will call him Tarzan now, and he thinks, oh, I'm not an ape, I'm actually a person like those Africans. But then he realizes the Africans are kind of superstitious, they're violent, they're cannibals, and he decides, no, he's not like they are. But when one of the Africans kills Tarzan's ape mother, the ape who had adopted him, he decides to go on a rampage against the Africans. He starts killing Africans. But along the way, he also steals a lot of their stuff. He steals bows and arrows, and he gets lassos, and he starts to wear clothes. He starts to take clothes off of the Africans and wear those clothes. And then, a while later, he sees another ship has a mutiny, and the ship is going to drop their passengers off on the same coast of Africa. And Tarzan runs into the mutineers. These are sailors. They're rough and tumble guys, and they're white, but they're kind of violent, etc. And Tarzan goes, "Oh, I'm not like the black Africans. I'm a white sailor." But then he sees the sailors are kind of stupid and violent, and he's like, "Oh no, I'm not like them." The sailors leave, but then he realizes that the passengers who have been dropped off are white and European, and he likes them a lot. They're an American professor, Professor Porter, and his daughter Jane, and there's a British aristocrat, Lord Greystoke, and these people don't know what they're doing in the jungle, so Tarzan decides to save them, and he uses his amazing skills to save them from lions and tigers and bears and Africans. But then the French army shows up, and the French officer gets taken by the cannibals, and Tarzan goes to save him, but the French take the porters and all the other Europeans away. And so Tarzan saves the army officer, and then they go all the way across the desert and get back to Europe on their own. Once he's in Europe, Tarzan realizes that he discovers that he's actually the son of Lord Greystoke. The fingerprints on the stuff in the cabin prove that he's actually the son of Lord Greystoke. And so he is Lord Greystoke. And then Tarzan decides to go and find Jane Porter, and he finds her in Wisconsin of all places, and saves her from a forest fire, and then asks her to marry him. Okay? And that's pretty much where the book ends. So how is this colonial ideology? Well, there's a whole bunch of themes running through the book that you don't notice because this is an adventure novel and this is an exciting story with, lions and tigers in the jungle and people fighting and killing each other and hand-to-hand combat and all that stuff. But there's a real message under here. First, one of the themes is evolution. Now, this book was written in 1912. Darwinism had been around for about 50 years at that point. It'd been about 40 years since Darwin had come out with the Descent of Man, saying that human beings had been produced by evolution from apes. And this theme starts to run through Tarzan of the Apes. In particular, by the early 1900s, a lot of Europeans had decided to try to apply Darwinism to societies and civilizations. And this was totally wrong. Darwin said this was wrong. He said essentially that the process of evolution through natural selection stops when you have civilization because people who would die off in the wild don't die off in civilization. If you're permanently injured or something, your other people take care of you, and so you don't die off. And so the process of evolution, the weak dying and the strong surviving, doesn't happen in a civilization. So Darwin said you can't apply evolution to civilizations. But a lot of Europeans and Americans wanted to. And they began to say, well, let's apply the ideas of evolution to civilization. And in particular, they began to argue that civilizations and races were locked in a Darwinian struggle for survival of the fittest. And so you could see which groups or races were more evolved by who was winning the survival of the fittest. This is a big mistake in terms of Darwinism. There's nothing in Darwinism about civilizations competing with each other, and races aren't biologically real units, etc. But Europeans and Americans wanted to apply Darwinism this way. Second, if Europeans and Americans wanted to claim that they were the most evolved, that different races were at different stages of evolution, and Europeans or Americans were at the height of it, they had to have some reason for saying we're winning the evolution race. The reason for that, or the justification they came up with, was we've got all the technologies. By 1912, we've got machine guns, we've got steamboats, we've got steam engines, railroads, telegraphs. We've got all the technology, and people in Africa don't, and people in Asia don't, and people in, etc. And so they claimed that you could sort of decide which race was the most evolved by which race had the most technology, or you could say technology is a measure of evolution. The more technology you have, the more evolved you are. This is also wrong. But Europeans thought that was the case, or some Europeans. Then there's a weird little idea that was current in European biology in the latter half of the 19th century. It's not right, but biologists thought it was scientifically true. It's called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's a mouthful. But basically what it says is that it was a biological theory that in the course of a human egg and sperm fertilizing and then growing into an fetus, an embryo, and then an infant child and growing up to adulthood, that process of an individual going from conception to adulthood recapitulated or copied or rehearsed the whole process of the human race's evolution. So the idea was that a fertilized egg was like a single-celled organism way back millions of years ago, and then as you develop in the womb and into adulthood, you go through all the stages of evolution that the whole human race went through. So I went, under this theory, I went through all the stages of evolution. Now this is not actually true, right? But Europeans thought so, and it was actually taught in biology courses across Europe and the United States for a long time. And that phrase was sort of drilled into students' minds. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Evolution is just like growing up, because the process of growing up is going through the stage of evolution. So evolution is like growing up. And what that meant was that if you want to compare different groups of people and suggest that one group is more evolved than the other, you're also suggesting that one group is more adult and the other group is more childlike, because evolution is like growing up. So the farther you are in evolution, the more grown up you are. This comes out in a whole bunch of popular phrases, slogans, writings, etc. in the late 19th century. The biggest example of this is White Man's Burden, Rudyard Kipling's poem, right? He wrote this poem in 1899 to convince America that it should colonize the Philippines right after the Spanish-American War. And he basically said, take up the white man's burden. Well, what's that? Well, I'm not going to go into the whole poem, but he basically says the white man's burden is that you have to go, the Africans and Asians are like children. They're farther behind in evolution, so they're like children, and grown-up Europeans have to go and act like parents to them. They have to discipline them and raise them because they can't just leave these kids alone. And so it's a call based on the idea of autogy recapitulates phylogeny. It's a call for Europeans and Americans as the most evolved to go and act like parents to Africa and Asia and raise them up. Although it's unclear as to what that would actually mean in evolutionary terms. Well, so this ultimately becomes a justification for colonization. The idea is that you're going to assert, without evidence, that Europeans and Americans are more evolved than Africans or Asians. You're going to assert that technology is a way of measuring how far along you are in evolution. You're going to assert that because Americans and Europeans have better guns and things, they're more evolved. And then you're going to assert that evolution is like growing up, so people in Africa and Asia are like children, and Europeans and Americans are like adults, and so they have a responsibility to go take control of these people and discipline them, like parents. What's that have to do with Tarzan? Everything. Let me go back through Tarzan really quickly. First of all, as Tarzan goes through the book, he grows up from being an infant to an adult. He goes through the stages of evolution in terms of what he thinks he is. At the beginning of the book, he thinks he's an ape. Then later in the book, he thinks he's a black African. Then later in the book, he thinks he's a lower class white European. And then at the end of the book, he finds out he's an aristocrat, an upper class European. And the book explicitly says that Tarzan is evolving, that uses the words of evolution. It talks about it. I mean, at the end of the book, Tarzan finds Jane and he says, I've come across the eons from the primal past to find you. He's implying that coming from Africa to Wisconsin is going through all the eons of evolution that land between those two spaces. He's not saying I went over miles, he's saying he went over eons. And so the book implies that Tarzan is evolving, but the really pernicious thing here is that it implies also that the stages of evolution are ape, black African, lower class white European, upper class white European. So it implies that those groups are stages on evolution, steps in the evolutionary ladder, because the book says Tarzan evolves and he goes through those stages. Then Tarzan measures his evolution at every step with new technologies. He thinks he's an ape, he finds the cabin, he gets the knife, and that's when he becomes better than the apes. And then when he kills the African and he takes his lasso and his bow and arrow and all that, he also takes his clothes, and the book explicitly says he wanted to mark his new stage of evolution with the markings of being a human being. So the clothes and the bow and arrow and the lasso are marks of his evolution. And then when he meets the lower class Europeans, he sees guns for the first time, and he writes for the first time to write them a note. And then at the end of the book, when he's an aristocrat, he's actually driving a car in Wisconsin to save Jane from the forest fire, etc. So there's technology involved. And in fact, at one point, Tarzan says to the French officer that he saved, he says, I don't know how the human race survived because you guys, like lions, could kill 1,000 of you in no time flat. And the officer replies, once you've seen our cities and our engineering works and our navies, etc., you'll understand that mind is more important than physical ability. And he implies both that human beings are more evolved because they have tools and that technology measures evolution. So Tarzan is measuring his evolution and his evolution through these stages by technology. And then finally, he is dominant in everything he does, right? The Africans, he's king of the apes. The Africans are terrified of him. They don't know who he is, or they can't ever catch him. The Europeans are terrified of him. He's way superior to all of them. Jane swoons over him. But the ultimate message of the book then is that if you're a white European, especially an upper class white European, and this is the message that all these teenage boys reading Tarzan get from the book. If you're a white upper class or middle class European, the Porters are middle class. If you're a white upper class or middle class European, you are so evolutionarily more evolved than lower class people or Africans or including women. I didn't talk about that, but that's in the book too. That you could be dropped into the jungle as an infant with no tools whatsoever, and your innate superiority, your evolutionary advantage, would lead you to all these technologies and you would become the dominant force in the jungle, you would dominate the jungle. It's a racist fantasy of white supremacy. And it's not even that subtle about it. If you read the book and look at the portrayals of black Africans and lower class white Europeans, etc., it's not even close. It's clearly racist. It's a colonial fantasy that European and American dominance in that one time period, late 19th century, early 20th century, is really based on evolutionary superiority. That evolution is like growing up, and Europeans are more evolved, and technology tells you they're more evolved, and so Europeans and Americans are like grown-ups, and they have a responsibility to go conquer the world and act like parents disciplining these unruly children in Africa and Asia. It's absolutely racist. It's white supremacist, but it's also a key part of Western culture and Western civilization, and it was a really crucial justification and way of spreading colonial ideology in the 20th century. If you like this, please subscribe to the channel, and we'll have more videos for you soon.